"Daniel, we're not in a position to revisit your compensation right now." He said it the same way he always did. Calm, measured, like he'd rehearsed it in the mirror that morning. It was 8:42 a.m. when the words landed. I remember because I caught myself looking at the clock the second he finished the sentence, the way you do when you've heard the same answer enough times that you start counting them by timestamps instead of dates. We were sitting in his office. Not a conference room this time. His office. That detail mattered, though I didn't realize why yet. Greg Halston, early 40s, a guy who'd been promoted twice since I joined the company, leaned back in his leather chair and folded his hands in front of him like he was about to deliver bad news to a stranger. Behind him, the corner window framed the city perfectly, like the view itself was part of his negotiating position. "I know this is the third year in a row," he added, "and I want you to know I see the work, Daniel. I do." He said it like it should mean something. I nodded once, slow, the way you nod when you're not actually agreeing, just registering the words have been spoken. There was a folder on his desk between us, same kind of folder as last year. Inside, I knew exactly what was printed. My salary, unchanged. Same number for 3 years running. "The thing is," he continued, "the budget cycle this quarter doesn't have flexibility. Profit margins are tight. We're holding the line on senior comp across the board. Profit margins." That word would matter more than he realized, but neither of us knew that yet. I let him keep talking. That's the part most people don't understand about these conversations. You don't argue, not when you've been in them before. You listen. You take in every word, every pause, every careful piece of language. Because once they decide, the words stop being about reasoning. They become explanation. An explanation is for the person doing the explaining, not the person hearing it. "You're one of the most reliable people on the team," he said. "That's not going to change." Reliable, important, stable. I had collected those words over the years like souvenirs from a trip I never wanted to take. My name is Daniel Cross. I'm 46 years old. At that point, I had spent 11 years inside that company. Senior Operations Director. The guy who ran the revenue-generating side of operations. Account integration, billing escalation, fulfillment management, the parts of the business that actually moved money. The boring parts. The ones that don't get presented at company-wide meetings because nothing about them is exciting until they break. Greg uncapped a pen, clicked it once, then put it back down. A nervous habit I had watched him develop over 3 years of these conversations. He always did it when he wanted to fill the silence without actually saying anything. "We'll revisit at the start of next fiscal year," he said. "I'll make sure you're on the priority list." The priority list. I had been on that list for 3 years. I leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, just enough to shift my weight. "Greg," I said. My tone was calm. I had practiced calm for a long time. He looked up. "Understood," I said. That was all. He blinked. I think he had been expecting pushback. Maybe a question, maybe a counter. He always left a little space in these meetings for me to advocate for myself, the way managers are trained to. It made the rejection feel collaborative. It made him feel like he had heard me out. But I had stopped advocating somewhere in the second year. He just hadn't noticed. I stood up, adjusted my jacket, and walked toward the door. Polite, professional. The way you walk out of a room when you've decided something but haven't told anyone yet. As I reached the door, I turned my head slightly, not to look at him, just to register the room one more time. 3 years, same office, same answer, same chair where I'd sat each time and agreed to wait. That was the last time I would sit in it. The hallway outside Greg's office was quiet that morning. Bright fluorescents, polished floors, the soft hum of printers somewhere down the corridor. I walked past 2 colleagues who nodded without stopping. They had no idea what had just happened in that room. Most people in that building had no idea what happened in any meeting that didn't involve them. That was always one of the things I had liked about working there. Privacy. Discretion. Now it just felt like erasure. I took the long way back to my desk, past the south side of the floor where the account management team sat. Through the glass partition, I could see Marcus, one of the junior directors, presenting to a small huddle. Slides on a wall screen, profit projections for the quarter. I slowed down for a second to read the numbers from the side. Margins for Q3 were projected to hold steady at 22%. Solid, healthy, strong. Those numbers existed because of decisions I made every day that nobody on that wall saw. But the slides didn't know that. The slides just showed the result. I kept walking. By the time I reached my desk, the screens were already lit. 3 monitors, one for the main financial operations dashboard, one for client account flows, one for billing exceptions. All 3 showed green. All 3 showed stable. That word again. Even my screens used it. I sat down, didn't move for a few seconds, just looked. Most people in the company thought my job was simple. They saw the dashboards. They saw the green. They saw quarterly reports that said operations were running smoothly. What they didn't see was the work it took to keep the dashboards green, the small adjustments, the morning calls to flag a contract anomaly before it triggered a billing dispute, the quiet rerouting of an account through a backup channel when the primary processor lagged, the decisions that didn't have a procedure document because they only existed in my head. I opened the main dashboard and looked at the figures for the previous day. On paper, perfect. Underneath, 3 small flags, nothing red, just yellow. 2 timing offsets in the billing cycle, 1 processing delay on a mid-tier account, things that would self-correct if you knew where to look, things that would become problems if you didn't. I had built every one of those yellow flag indicators myself. None of them were part of the company's standard reporting suite. None of them showed up in Marcus's slides or Greg's leadership reports. They existed because I had built them, quietly, over the years, because I needed to see what no one else was looking at. That was the work nobody priced into compensation discussions. You can't put ability to see invisible problems on a salary spreadsheet. It doesn't fit the structure, so it doesn't get paid. Around 10:15 a.m., my phone buzzed, a direct line. I recognized the number, Vanmark Industries, one of our top 5 accounts by revenue contribution. I answered on the second ring. Daniel. Marina. She was their AP controller. We had worked together for 6 years. She didn't call unless something was off. "We're seeing a discrepancy on yesterday's reconciliation," she said. "About 40 grand sitting in suspense. Looks like a timing mismatch." I pulled up their account while she was talking. I could see it before she finished her sentence. A batch that had processed 30 seconds outside the standard window, small enough that the system hadn't flagged it, big enough that it would compound by the end of the week if I didn't catch it now. "I see it," I said. "Give me 10 minutes. Take your time." I hung up and got to work. 8 minutes later, the suspense balance was cleared. No ticket, no escalation, no internal email. Marina got her clean reconciliation. The Vanmark contract stayed intact. Q3 margins stayed at 22%. Greg's projections stayed on track. And nobody in the building knew it had happened. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the green dashboard. For the first time in 11 years, I wasn't proud of the green. I was just tired of being the reason for it. The first time Greg told me to wait, it sounded almost generous. That was 3 years before the morning in his office. The company had just finished a restructuring. A big one. 2 regional offices consolidated, a dozen positions eliminated, a new senior leadership layer brought in from outside. Everyone on my floor was waiting to see who would be cut next. Nobody was thinking about raises. We were thinking about timing. So when I sat down for my annual review that year and asked calmly whether there was room to revisit my compensation, Greg gave me what I now recognize as the most carefully chosen no of his career. "Daniel, I'm going to be straight with you. This isn't the cycle. We have a hearing freeze coming. Investors are watching margin tightening. If I push for an adjustment for you now, I lose credibility I'm going to need to protect you later. Let's set this up for next year. I want to be aggressive about it, just not now." It was a good answer, the kind that makes the person hearing it feel like a partner instead of a problem. I walked out of that meeting actually feeling reassured. I told my wife about it that night, told her Greg had handled it well, that he was looking out for me, that next year would be different. I believed him. That was the worst part looking back. Not that he lied, that I believed him with no resistance at all. 3 weeks later, Tyler Reese joined the company, 28 years old, fresh MBA, sharp, quick on his feet, good at slides, better at meetings. Greg sat me down the day Tyler started and told me with what felt at the time like genuine appreciation that he wanted me to mentor him, show him how operations really worked. "You're the best teacher we have," Greg said. "This is the kind of work that gets noticed." I agreed. Of course I agreed. I trained Tyler the way I would have trained anyone with potential, showed him the dashboards, walked him through the yellow flag indicators I had built, explained the timing offsets, the reconciliation patterns, the early warning signs that lived between the lines of the official reports. He listened well, asked the right questions, took clean notes. 6 months later, he was the one presenting operations updates to senior leadership. I sat in the back of those meetings. Sometimes I was asked to join, sometimes I wasn't. The information was always mine. The voice in the room was Tyler's. That bothered me less than it should have. I was still telling myself the story. The story where my value was so obvious it would speak for itself eventually. The story where I was building toward something bigger by doing the right work, the kind of work that doesn't get applause. A year went by. The next review cycle came. Greg sat across from me again, this time in a smaller conference room, and gave me my second no. "Daniel, the company is doing better, you're right, but we're recalibrating compensation bands. We need to make sure we're consistent across senior operations. Otherwise, we create internal friction. I want to revisit this once the bands are settled, probably next year." Consistent, friction, bands, different words, same result. I nodded the way I always did, polite, professional. Asked 1 or 2 clarifying questions to make him feel heard. Then I went back to my desk and kept doing the work. But that was the year something started to shift, not externally, internally. I stopped expecting the next conversation to be different. I started watching how the company actually distributed value, who got the meetings, who got the credit, who got the promotions, who got asked to teach others without ever being promoted themselves. I wasn't being overlooked. I was being used in exactly the place they wanted me, reliable, invisible, productive. And by then Tyler had been promoted twice. The system wasn't broken for me. The system was working exactly as designed. I just wasn't the one it was designed for. That afternoon I made a decision I didn't announce to anyone. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't write it down. I didn't tell my wife when I got home that night. I didn't even fully articulate it to myself in words at first. It was more like a quiet adjustment, a small turn of a knob inside me that I'd been holding still for 3 years. I was going to stop covering. That's the only word for it, covering. For more than a decade, I had built a job around invisible protection, catching things before they surfaced, fixing them before they reached anyone's attention, making the system look easier than it actually was. And I had done it without ever asking whether the people I was protecting understood the cost. They didn't. That was the answer. They never had. So that afternoon, around 2:15 p.m., a yellow flag came up on one of the billing dashboards, a reconciliation lag on a smaller account, the kind of thing I would normally clean up within 5 or 6 minutes. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I closed the tab, not ignored, just left alone. The flag would either resolve on its own through the standard process, or it would escalate naturally through the official channels. Either way, the system would handle it the way the system was supposed to, not the way I had taught it to behave. It felt strange. I won't pretend it didn't. 11 years of habit don't quiet down in an afternoon. I caught myself reaching for the keyboard twice in the next hour. Both times I stopped. Both times I let it go. Around 3:00 p.m. I opened a blank document. Then I started typing. Not anything dramatic, just process notes. The ones I had carried in my head for years. how the Vanmark reconciliation cycle worked, why the timing offset mattered, which accounts had unique sequencing requirements that weren't documented anywhere, which clients responded to which communication patterns, the small judgment calls that made the difference between a quiet day and an escalation. I wrote clearly, plainly, the way you write when you're not assuming anyone will be there to interpret you later. Because the truth was, for the first time, I wasn't assuming I'd always be there. That was a new feeling. I didn't write everything. There were things I wrote down. There were things I didn't. The procedures could be documented. The instincts couldn't. You can write the steps of a recipe. You can't write the moment when a cook tastes something and knows it needs salt without measuring. That part was mine. 11 years of it. Greg hadn't paid for it. He wouldn't inherit it. Around 4:00 p.m., the yellow flag I had left alone earlier triggered a secondary alert. Not red yet. Orange. 2 team members on the account ops floor noticed and pinged each other in the shared channel. I watched it move through the chat for a few minutes. Saw them ask each other if anyone knew the cause. Saw them eventually escalate to Tyler. Tyler messaged me directly. "Hey Daniel, quick one. Got a reconciliation lag on account 4471. Any idea what triggers that?" I looked at the message for about 30 seconds before responding. Check the cycle timing against the processor batch window, most likely a 30-second offset. That was it. I didn't pull the data myself. I didn't open the account. I gave him what he needed to find it on his own. The way I would have explained it to anyone who actually had the role. He thanked me, said he'd take a look. He did, eventually, about 40 minutes later. By then the lag had compounded slightly. Not enough to break anything. Enough to require manual correction on 3 downstream entries instead of 1. A small thing. The kind of thing that doesn't matter on its own. But it was the first time in 11 years a problem I could have caught at minute 1 had been allowed to grow to minute 40. Greg walked past my desk shortly after that, gave me his usual nod. "Everything quiet today." "All running," I said. He smiled, kept walking. He didn't ask what running meant. He never had. The call came 8 days after that afternoon. I had spent those 8 days doing something I had never done before, working exactly the job I was paid for, not the version I had been performing for 11 years, the actual version, the one on paper, the one on my contract, the one Greg had built his compensation logic around. I answered emails within standard response times. I closed tickets in the queue they were assigned to. I attended the meetings I was required to attend and contributed exactly what was expected of a senior operations director, no more. I didn't volunteer the small catches anymore. I didn't reach across into the workflows where I wasn't formally responsible. I worked the role I had been priced for. It was the easiest 8 days of my career, and the dashboards were starting to look different. Not dramatically, just less polished. A few more yellow flags lingering longer than they used to. A few small client questions that took 2 emails to resolve instead of 1 preemptive call. A reconciliation cycle that ran 20 minutes late on Tuesday. Things that wouldn't show up on any leadership report yet. Things that wouldn't get Greg's attention. But things that were there if you knew where to look. I knew where to look. Nobody else seemed to. It was Wednesday afternoon when my phone rang. Unknown number. Local area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. I picked up on the 4th ring because something about the timing felt like a moment worth answering. "Daniel Cross." A pause. Then a voice I recognized faintly. "Daniel, it's Howard Lynn from Estrega." It took me a second to place him. Then it landed. Howard had been the operations VP at Estrega Holdings, one of our larger accounts, about 4 years ago. We had worked through a major integration crisis together. 3 weeks of late-night calls and weekend escalations. The kind of project that creates a different kind of professional relationship. Not friendship exactly, something more durable. "Howard," I said, "it's been a while." "It has. I won't waste your time. I'm at a different company now. I've been here about a year and a half. We've been building out an operations leadership team. Your name came up in a conversation last week. More than once, actually. From 3 different people who'd worked with you over the years. That's why I'm calling." He paused. I didn't feel it. I'd learned that in 11 years too. When someone has something real to say, you let them say it. We need someone who knows what they're doing on the financial operations side, not someone who manages it from a slide deck, someone who actually understands the work. The compensation we're offering is meaningful. I'd like to talk. He named a number. I didn't react out loud, but I felt it. It wasn't just higher than what I was making. It was clear. There was no language around it, no alignment discussion, no band recalibration, no reference to fiscal cycles or investor expectations, just a number that reflected what the work was worth. "Howard," I said, "give me 24 hours. Take 48 if you need them, but I'd like to keep this moving." We talked for another 10 minutes. About the role, the team, the structure. I asked the questions I had learned to ask after 11 years of watching how organizations worked from the inside. He answered all of them without hesitation. The answers were clean, not perfect, real. The kind of answers that come from someone who has actually thought through what they're building. I hung up the phone and sat at my desk for a long time. The dashboards were still in front of me. Green, stable, the word that had defined my entire career. I didn't feel excitement. I didn't feel relief. What I felt was something closer to confirmation. The kind of confirmation that doesn't change a decision. It clarifies one. I had already known what I was going to do. The call had just put a date on it. I would give my notice the next morning. I gave my notice at 9:00 a.m. the next morning, not by email, in person. I walked to Greg's office, knocked twice, and waited for him to wave me in. He was on a call. He held up one finger, finished the conversation in about 2 minutes, and looked at me with the same polite half-smile he gave everyone who came through his door. "Daniel." "Sit down. What's on your mind?" I sat. "Greg," I said, "I'm submitting my resignation. My last day will be in 4 weeks. I wanted to tell you directly before anything went through HR." He didn't say anything for a few seconds, just looked at me. I could see him cycling through reactions on the inside while keeping his face perfectly composed. That part I had to give him credit for. He was good at the surface. "This is unexpected," he finally said. I nodded. "Can I ask where you're going?" "Strega Holdings, senior operations role." He nodded slowly, reached for his coffee, took a sip he didn't actually want. "Is this about the compensation discussion?" "No," I said. He looked at me carefully. "No. It's about the same compensation discussion. 3 years of it. The conclusion was always going to be the same. I'm not making this decision because of yesterday. I'm making it because of the pattern." He didn't argue. That was the first sign that everything I had decided was correct. A manager who actually wanted to keep someone would have argued. He would have asked what it would take. He would have suggested a counter. He would have at least pretended for a few minutes that the next conversation would be different. Greg did none of that. "I appreciate the honesty," he said. "We'll make the transition smooth." That word again, smooth. The corporate language for "we will not feel this until later." "I want to make sure Tyler has everything he needs," I said. "I've been documenting processes for the past week. I'll continue building those out over the next 4 weeks. Whatever you need from me, I'll do." "That's appreciated. Thank you, Daniel." I stood up, adjusted my jacket, walked to the door. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The conversation had told me exactly what I already knew. I was a name on a spreadsheet, a salary line that had just become available. The transition would be managed the way every corporate transition gets managed. With process, not regret. HR scheduled the exit meeting within 2 hours. Same conference room as before, same tone, same calm efficiency. "We appreciate everything you've contributed, Daniel. We want to ensure a clean handoff." Clean, I almost smiled. I spent the next 4 weeks doing exactly what I had promised. No more, no less. I documented the official processes thoroughly. Every standard procedure, every formal escalation path, every system access requirement, every client communication template. I built out a handoff binder that any competent operations director could use to keep the surface running. What I didn't document was the layer underneath. The yellow flag monitoring system I had built. The timing instincts, the early warning patterns, the specific account quirks that lived in my head but had never been encoded anywhere. Those weren't in my job description. They never had been. They had been my unpaid contribution to a system that didn't recognize them as contribution. Tyler sat with me almost every day during those 4 weeks. He took notes, asked good questions, tried to absorb as much as he could. I answered everything he asked, honestly, clearly, without holding back, but I didn't fill in the gaps he didn't know existed. When he asked about Vanmark, I told him what was documented about Vanmark. I didn't tell him about Marina or the 6 years of phone calls that had built that account's stability. When he asked about reconciliation cycles, I walked him through the official process. I didn't walk him through the 30-second offsets that didn't appear in any manual. He didn't know what to ask about, so he didn't ask. And I didn't volunteer. That wasn't malice. It was math. They had priced my contribution. I was delivering exactly what the price had purchased. Nothing more. My last day was a Friday in late October. There was no meeting, no speech, no farewell email beyond the standard one HR sent to the whole company. We thank Daniel Cross for his 11 years of service and wish him well in his next chapter. That was it. 11 years compressed into 18 words. I packed my desk over the course of the afternoon. Personal items first. A photo of my wife and daughter that had sat in the same spot for 9 years. A small framed quote my sister had given me when I first took the senior role. A coffee mug from a conference I had attended in Chicago in 2018. 2 pens I had been using for so long they felt like extensions of my hand. Everything else stayed. The screens, the dashboards, the binders, the procedural documentation I had spent 4 weeks building. All of it belonged to the company. I had been careful about that. Nothing went home that wasn't mine. Nothing stayed that didn't belong. At 4:45 p.m., Tyler came over to my desk. He stood there for a second, hands in his pockets like he was trying to find the right tone. "Daniel, I just wanted to say thanks. Seriously, I learned a lot from you. You're welcome. If I have questions after you're gone, would it be okay to reach out?" I looked at him. He meant it. He was a decent person. That wasn't the problem. "You'll have my email," I said. "Within reason." He nodded, smiled, walked away. At 5:00 p.m., I shut down my workstation, picked up my bag, and walked out of the building, past the front desk, past the security guard who gave me a half nod without looking up, past the parking lot where I had pulled in every morning for over a decade. No one stopped me. No one said anything more than the standard goodbye. The exit was as quiet as the entrance had been 11 years before. I drove home that evening with no music on. The road was quiet. The day was over. The 11 years were over, and for the first time in a long time I wasn't carrying anything with me. No mental list of issues to check on Monday. No backlog of escalations to monitor over the weekend. No nagging awareness of a yellow flag I had left open and needed to revisit. It felt strange, not bad, just unfamiliar. I started at Estrega on the following Monday. Howard had been clear about onboarding. 3 weeks of structured orientation. A formal handoff from the outgoing leader. Real introductions to the team, the systems, the accounts. Everything you'd expect from a company that valued the role enough to do it properly. It was a different world, not because the work was easier. The work was harder in some ways because the expectations were higher, but the expectations were also visible, documented, discussed, compensated. I was being paid for the work I did, not for the work that would have shown up on a slide. The dashboards there had different colors, different layouts, different priorities, but what was new was the feeling that everything I did was actually counted. The first message from someone at my old company came on the following Thursday, 9 days after my last day. It wasn't from Tyler. It was from a guy named Devin who had worked in the account ops team for years. We weren't close, but we had always been on good terms. "Hey Daniel, quick question if you have a second. Seeing some weird timing stuff on a few of the bigger accounts. Tried checking with Tyler, but he wasn't sure either. Any guidance? I read it twice. I didn't reply for an hour. When I did, I kept it short. Devin, hope you're doing well. I'm not in a position to advise on internal processes anymore. Best path is to escalate through Tyler or open a formal ticket. Wishing you all the best. He didn't push back. He just said thanks. But the next message came 2 days later. Different person. Similar question. Then another. Then another. By the end of the second week, I was getting 2 or 3 messages a week from people at my old company. Quiet, indirect, slightly worried. The kind of messages you send when you're starting to realize something is off but you can't quite articulate what. The drift had started, right on schedule. By the end of the third week, the tone had changed completely. The messages weren't casual anymore. They weren't framed as quick questions. They had the shape of people who were starting to understand they were inside something they couldn't see the edges of. Daniel, are you available for a brief call? Daniel, can you walk me through how the Vanmark cycle was supposed to look? Daniel, we're seeing variances we can't explain. Is there context you can share? I didn't take the calls. I answered the questions politely, briefly, and always in writing. Most of the time, my answers pointed back to the documentation I had built during my 4-week transition. Everything I knew that could be documented was documented. The rest wasn't mine to give anymore. But I noticed the pattern. The questions weren't coming from people on the operations floor only. They were coming from account managers, from client services leads, from a junior analyst who reported into finance. People who normally would have no reason to reach across departmental lines to ask an outsider about internal processes. That meant the issues weren't contained inside operations anymore. They had started to spread. The first real signal came from Marina at Vanmark. She emailed me directly, not through any channel related to my old company, just a personal note. Daniel, I wanted to thank you again for everything over the years. I want to be transparent with you. We're reviewing our service agreement with your former employer. The last 3 weeks have raised questions we hadn't anticipated. I don't expect you to comment on anything internal. I just wanted you to know that the work you did mattered to us, more than I think your management understood. I read that email twice. Then I closed it without responding for a long time. When I finally did reply, I kept it simple. Marina, thank you. I appreciate that more than you know. I wish you the best whatever direction you take. I didn't ask any questions. I didn't volunteer any context. I didn't want to know any specifics, but I knew what was happening. Vanmark was one of the top 5 accounts by revenue contribution. If they were reviewing their agreement, others were too. Inside the company, things were apparently moving faster than anyone had expected. I heard about it in fragments. A friend who still worked in the building told me there had been 3 closed-door meetings with senior leadership in a single week. Tyler had been in all of them. Greg had been in too. The tone, from what my friend described, was no longer about explanation. It was about damage control. Profit margins for the quarter had slipped. Not collapsed yet, just slipped. From the projected 22% down to 18%, then to 16% within 2 weeks. The kind of drop that doesn't sound catastrophic in isolation, but in operations terms it represents millions of dollars and 100 small failures stacked on top of each other. By the end of the 3rd week after my last day, the actual number had landed. Profit margins had crashed by 45% against quarter-over-quarter projections. Not revenue, margins. The cleaner, harder, more telling number. The one that doesn't lie about how a company is actually running. 45%. That doesn't happen because of one failure. It happens because of 100 small things stopping at the same time. The yellow flag indicators nobody was watching. The reconciliation cycles drifting outside their windows. The client questions taking 3 days to answer instead of 3 hours. The contracts losing volume quietly because nobody noticed the patterns early enough. That was when my name started coming up. I heard it from 2 different people in the same week. Quietly. Almost as rumor. Greg mentioned you in the leadership meeting yesterday. Tyler said he wished he had asked more questions during the transition. Someone in finance asked whether you'd be open to a consulting arrangement. I didn't respond to any of them, I just listened. Because everything that was happening now was always going to happen. They were just finally seeing it. The call came on a Friday afternoon, almost exactly 4 weeks after my last day. I was in my new office at Estrega. Late in the afternoon, most of the team had already left for the weekend. The light through the window was that low, slanting kind that turns everything a softer color. I had a stack of documents on my desk that I was working through, and my phone was face down beside them. It buzzed. I turned it over. Unknown number. Same area code as my old company. I let it ring twice. Then I picked up. Daniel Cross. A pause. Then a voice I didn't immediately recognize. Daniel, this is Patrick Levinson. I'm the chief operating officer at the company. I don't think we've spoken directly before. I leaned back in my chair. I knew the name. I had seen it in company-wide emails. I had sat in 2 or 3 large town halls where he had presented, but we had never had a one-on-one conversation. Senior operations directors rarely did with COOs in companies that size. That was part of the point. Patrick, I said, I appreciate you calling. I'll be direct with you. We're going through a difficult quarter. I think you may have heard some of the noise. I've heard fragments. Then you probably have a sense of the magnitude. I won't go into specifics on the phone, but the operations side has been challenged in a way we didn't anticipate. We're working through it, and in the process your name has come up consistently, from multiple directions, from people whose judgment I trust. He paused. He was leaving room for me to ask questions. I didn't ask any. I had learned to recognize when silence was the most useful thing to offer in a conversation. What I'm hoping, he continued, is that we could find a way to bring you in on a consulting basis. Short term, whatever structure works for you. We'd be open to whatever you need to make that workable. I let that sit for a moment. Patrick, can I ask you a direct question? Of course. Have you reviewed the compensation history I had over my last 3 years at the company? He was silent for a few seconds, the kind of silence that happens when someone realizes the conversation just shifted in a direction they hadn't fully prepared for. I have not personally, no, but I'm aware of the broad picture. I'd encourage you to look at the specifics, not as a complaint, as context, because everything that's happening right now is downstream of decisions that were made over those 3 years. And I think it would be useful for you to understand that before we have any further conversation. That's fair, he said. His tone was careful now, measured. I could hear him processing. I will do that. I appreciate the candor. I'm not trying to make this personal, I said. I'm trying to make it accurate. Understood. He cleared his throat. Daniel, regardless of what I find, would you be open to a conversation about consulting? We're willing to be generous on compensation. We're willing to be flexible on structure. We just need someone who actually understands the systems. I looked out the window for a few seconds. The afternoon light was almost gone now. The sky was that pale gray that happens right before it gives up and gets dark. I thought about Greg. I thought about 3 years of stable. I thought about Tyler being promoted twice. I thought about the 11 years I had spent making decisions that nobody in that building had bothered to understand. And I thought about where I was now. Howard Lynn's company, Estrega, a place where the work was visible, where the role was respected, where the people I worked with assumed competence and asked questions instead of writing me off into stable. Patrick, I said, I'll think about it. I'll be in touch by Monday. That was all I gave him. I spent the weekend thinking about it. Not the offer specifically. The decision underneath the offer. My wife asked me about it Saturday morning over coffee. I told her the whole conversation. I told her about Patrick, about the consulting offer, about the careful language, about the willingness to be flexible on compensation. She listened the way she always did, patient, quiet, not pushing one way or the other. What do you want to do? She finally asked. I thought about it for a long time before answering. I want to be useful, I said, but I don't want to fix something that they could have prevented. They had 11 years to value what I did. They had 3 years to fix the compensation. I'm not interested in rescuing the consequences of choices they made. She nodded once. Then you already know. I did. I called Patrick Monday morning at 9:00 a.m. He picked up on the second ring. Daniel, thanks for circling back. Patrick, I've thought about it carefully over the weekend. I'm not going to be available for a consulting arrangement. There was a brief pause, not an offended one. Just the kind of pause that happens when a senior executive realizes they're not going to get the outcome they wanted. I appreciate you considering it, he said. Can I ask what factored into the decision? A few things. The most important one is that I've taken a new role somewhere my work is recognized. That role deserves my full attention. Stepping out of it, even part-time, would compromise something I've just started to build. I'm not willing to do that. That's a fair answer. There's a second piece, I said. I worked at the company for 11 years. The last 3 of those years, I asked for a compensation adjustment 3 separate times. Each time the answer was framed as a delay. Each time the actual decision was a no. The work I did during those 3 years was the same work that you're now trying to recover. The reason that work is hard to recover is because nobody understood what it was. That wasn't an accident. It was a culture. I'm not in a position to fix culture from the outside. Patrick was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different, less corporate, less measured, more honest. Daniel, I want to be straight with you. I did review the file this weekend. I saw what happened with your compensation discussions. I'm not going to defend it. The way that was handled doesn't reflect what we say our values are. I'm sorry that happened to you. I wish we had caught it earlier. I appreciated that he said it. I really did, but I also knew exactly what it was worth. An apology after a 45% margin crash is the easiest apology a company will ever give. The hard apology is the one that comes from a budget meeting where someone says, we should pay him what he's worth. That apology had been available for 3 years. Nobody had made it. Thank you, Patrick, I said. I appreciate you saying that. I wish you all the best in working through the quarter. Likewise. And Daniel, if anything changes on your end, the door is open. I know, thank you. We ended the call. I set the phone down on my desk. I sat there for a few minutes. Same office, same view, same documents I had been working through on Friday. Nothing about my world had changed, but something had closed. The 3 years of stable, the 11 years of invisible work, the 2 promotions for Tyler that I had quietly enabled, the 45% margin crash that confirmed everything I had known. All of it sat behind me now, not in the way of bitterness, in the way of completion. There's a lesson somewhere in this story, but it isn't a complicated one. Work has value, understanding has value. And if the place you're standing in doesn't recognize either, eventually it will recognize the absence of both. You don't have to prove anything. You don't have to explain anything. You just have to be willing to leave. The system will tell the rest of the story by itself.